Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. I'm Maria Salvador, your moderator for today's program. I'm joined in the studio audience by students from Stonewall Jackson High School and Parkside Middle School. Welcome. The Newbery Medal is awarded annually to the author of the most distinguished contribution to American literature for young people in a publishing year. With us is Lois Lowry. She has received this award not once, but twice. Though entirely different, her Newbery winners, Number the Stars and The Giver, are considered modern classics. One is historical fiction set in Denmark during World War II. The other is speculative fiction describing an all too possible and downright chilling world. Miss Lowry is a versatile writer whose books continue to be received warmly by critics of all ages, and especially the young people who read them. Welcome, Lois Lowry.
Thank you, Maria. Nice to be here.
You were born in Hawaii, but didn't stay there very long. Tell us about your early years.
Well, I was born in Honolulu because my father was a career Army officer, and he was stationed there. And I was born in 1937. Left Honolulu when I was 3 years old. So moving ahead in time, it's 1941, and we all know what happened in Honolulu in 1941. By then, I was living in New York, but one of my earliest memories is running out to the sidewalk where my father was about to get into a car and saying, "Daddy, Mama heard something on the radio and she's crying." And that was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So not long after that, my father, being an Army officer, had to go overseas to the Pacific.
And how long was he gone?
Well, the war ended in 1945 when I was 8 years old, and he returned only briefly and then had to go back to Japan. We eventually joined him there. But he was gone through the large chunk of my childhood, my elementary school years.
Well, you said you joined him in Japan, so you lived in Tokyo.
I started 7th grade in Tokyo and went through 8th grade. I lived there when I was 11, 12, 13 years old.
Well, what did you do when you returned to the United States?
We had to leave Japan. That is, my mother, sister, brother, and I had to leave Japan because the Korean War began. Isn't it a shame to think of your own childhood, and all of these guys do as well, being permeated by war. But the Korean War began in 1950 when I was 13, and so we left Japan. My father had to stay there, and we went back to the town where our grandparents lived in Pennsylvania. Waited until Dad could come home, and then we moved to New York. I went to high school in New York City.
When did you decide you were a writer? When did you start? Were you always a writer?
Way back in 1947, there was a children's magazine called Jack and Jill, and every month they published letters from children, and every month I wrote them letters. And they never published mine until 1947, August, when I was 10 years old, and in that letter published in 1947, it says, "I want to be a writer when I grow up." It also says I'm writing a novel. It's called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13. I have no memory of that, but it says that on those printed pages.
That's amazing.
Writing was what I always liked best, always did best. I majored in writing in college.
Oh, so when did you decide you wanted to write for young people?
Well, that happened really by chance. I was writing for grown-ups. Let me interject, though. I had married very young. People did that in those days. 19 years old, got married, had a baby when I was 20, baby when I was 21, baby when I was 24, baby when I was 25. Didn't have time to do much writing. But then finally, when the kids were in school, I began writing for magazines, and that was writing for adults. And then just by chance, an editor wrote to me, a children's book editor, and said, "Would you consider writing for young people?" I should have thought of it myself because I had 4 young people living in my house. But at her invitation, I wrote my first book, which was called A Summer to Die. 1977, I was 40 years old when it was published.
It's amazing. Tell us a little bit about A Summer to Die.
Well, I think very often, and perhaps you kids who are studying writing now have experienced this very often. When you begin writing, you use experiences that you've had, memories that you've had. And I had an older sister, 3 years older. She was my best friend growing up, also my worst enemy, because that's the way sisters are. My partner in crime sometimes, my sidekick. But she had died young. And so when at 40 years old, actually 39 when I wrote the book, I began to think what I wanted to write about. I thought about those years with my sister, and that's what that book is about the effect on an entire family of the death of the older daughter, told through the eyes of the younger daughter. I made myself 13 in the book. Named myself Meg, and named my sister Molly. Those were not our real names, of course.
Well, as an adult, you have a friend whose experiences during World War II connected you and she in a concrete way.
And actually, that story is connected in a way to my sister. My friend Annalisa is Danish. I met her in this country, but she'd grown up in Denmark. And one time we were talking, this is as we were grown women with children of our own, and I mentioned my sister and the death of my sister, and Annalisa told me she had had a sister, an older sister who had died when she was young also. And I asked her what had caused her sister's death. My own sister died of cancer. And she said her sister had been newly married, expecting a baby, and had died in childbirth, and the baby had also died. Well, I was astonished because Denmark is a civilized country with good medical care, and I said, how could that happen? She said it was during the war. We were occupied by the Nazis. We had no medical care, very poor nutrition, no food. And so that began my interest in something I should have known from history courses. And when Annalisa went on to tell me what had happened in Denmark and how Denmark had saved its Jewish population from the Nazis, I realized that was a great story to tell for kids, a true story. But I wanted to tell it in a way like a story so kids would remember it.
And it won the Newbery Medal.
It did, yeah. And Annalisa was there that evening when I received the medal, yeah, yeah.
The Newbery Medal is given at a big, big function with literally thousands of people there. Yeah. And the speech is recorded, and so if anybody is interested in listening to it, they can probably hear it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's change in the air in Number the Stars as it begins. Would you share the early scene where Annalisa, her sister, her little sister Kirsty, and their friend Ellen, a Jewish girl, are racing down the street?
Yeah, Annalisa was my real friend, and I've named the girl in the book Anne Marie. Doesn't really matter, but I changed a few things for the book. And so here the girls are running down the street, Anne Marie and her Jewish friend Ellen. Anne Marie looked up panting just as she reached the corner. Her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. "Halt," the soldier ordered in a stern voice. The German word was as familiar as it was frightening. Anne Marie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Kirsty was plodding along, her face in a pout because the girls hadn't waited for her. Anne Marie stared up. There were two of them. That meant two helmets, two sets of cold eyes glaring at her, and four tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking her path to home. And it meant two rifles, gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first, then finally she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. "Why are you running?" the harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Anne Marie thought with contempt. 3 years they've been in our country and still they can't speak our language. "I was racing with my friends," she answered politely. "We have races at school every Friday and I want to do well, so I..." Her voice trailed away, the sentence unfinished. "Don't talk so much," she told herself. "Just answer them, that's all." She glanced back. Ellen was motionless on the sidewalk a few yards behind her, and farther back Kirsty was still sulking, walking slowly toward the corner. Nearby, a woman who had come to the doorway of a shop was standing silently, watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved toward her. Anne Marie recognized him as the one she and Ellen always called in whispers the giraffe, because of his height and the long neck that extended from his stiff collar. He and his partner were always on this corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Anne Marie trembled. "What is in here?" he asked loudly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of the doorway, out of sight. "School books," she answered truthfully. "You a good student?" the soldier asked. He seemed to be sneering. "Yes." "What is your name?" "Anne Marie Johansson." "Your friend, she a good student too?" He was looking beyond her at Ellen, who hadn't moved. Anne Marie looked back too and saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was pale and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. "Better than me," she said. "What's her name?" "Ellen." "And who is this?" he asked, looking to Anne-Marie's side. Kirsty had appeared there suddenly, scowling at everyone. "My little sister." She reached down for Kirsty's hand, but Kirsty, always stubborn, refused it and put her hands on her hips defiantly. The soldier reached down and stroked her little sister's short, tangled curls. "Stand still, Kirsty," Anne-Marie ordered silently, praying that somehow the obstinate 5-year-old would receive the message. But Kirsty reached up and pushed the soldier's hand away. "Don't," she said loudly. Both soldiers began to laugh. They spoke to each other in rapid German that Anne-Marie couldn't understand. "She's pretty, like my own little girl," the tall one said in a more pleasant voice. Anne-Marie tried to smile politely. "Go home, all of you. Go study your school books, and don't run. You look like hoodlums when you run."
It's chilling. The changes come about gradually, but Anne-Marie knows something serious is going on when the list of Danish Jews is taken from the synagogue. Ellen comes to stay with Anne-Marie and her family. Would you read the scene in which the German soldiers come to their apartment?
"Your names?" the officer barked. "Anne-Marie Johansson, and this is my sister." "Quiet. Let her speak for you herself. Your name?" He was glaring at Ellen. Ellen swallowed. "Lisa," she said, and cleared her throat. "Lisa Johansson." The officer stared at them grimly. "Now," Mama said in a strong voice, "you have seen that we are not hiding anything. May my children go back to bed?" The officer ignored her, and suddenly he grabbed a handful of Ellen's hair. Ellen winced. He laughed scornfully. "You have a blonde child sleeping in the other room, and you have this blonde daughter." He gestured toward Anne-Marie with his head. "Where did you get the dark-haired one?" He twisted the lock of Ellen's hair. "From a different father? From the milkman?" Papa stepped forward. "Don't speak to my wife in such a way. Let go of my daughter, or I will report you for such treatment." "Or maybe you got her someplace else," the officer continued with a sneer. "From the Rosens?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Anne-Marie, watching in panic, saw her father move swiftly to the small bookcase and take out a book. She saw that he was holding the family photograph album. Very quickly, he searched through its pages, found what he was looking for, and tore out 3 pictures from 3 separate pages. He handed them to the German officer who released Ellen's hair. "You will see each of my daughters, each with her name written on the photograph," Papa said. Anne-Marie knew instantly which photographs he had chosen. The album had many snapshots, all the poorly focused pictures of school events, birthday parties, but it also contained a portrait taken by a photographer of each girl as a tiny infant. And Mama had written in her delicate handwriting the name of each baby daughter across the bottom of these photographs. She realized, too, with an icy feeling, why Papa had torn them from the book. At the bottom of each page, below the photograph itself, was written the date. And the real Lisa Johansson had been born 21 years earlier. "Kirsten Elizabeth," the officer read, looking at Kirsty's baby picture. He let the photograph fall to the floor. "Anne-Marie," he read next, glanced at her, dropped the second photograph. "Lisa Margreta," he read finally, and stared at Ellen for a long, unwavering moment. In her mind, Anne-Marie pictured the photograph that he held, the baby, wide-eyed, propped against a pillow, her tiny hand holding a silver teething ring, her bare feet visible below the hem of an embroidered dress, and the wispy curls, dark. The officer tore the photograph in half and dropped the pieces on the floor. Then he turned, the heels of his shiny boots grinding into the pictures, and left the apartment. Without a word, the other 2 officers followed. Papa stepped forward and closed the door behind him. Anne-Marie relaxed the clenched fingers of her right hand, which still clutched Ellen's necklace. She looked down and saw that she had imprinted the Star of David into her palm.
I've read that more than once, Lois, and I still get chills. what makes this even more chilling is because this story is based in fact. In a note at the end of Number the Stars, you let your readers know about your research and what was true, including a letter you came across. Would you read that letter to us and tell us what you're trying to convey?
Yes, in Denmark, I came across a photograph of a young man who was a member of the resistance movement. I created the character of Peter in the book based on this young man. He had been executed by the Nazis, and he knew he was to be killed the next day when he wrote a letter to his mother. And this is just a small section of that letter that he wrote the night before he was put to death. I want you all to remember that you must not dream yourselves back to the times before the war, but the dream for you all, young and old, must be to create an ideal of human decency, and not a narrow-minded and prejudiced one. This is the great gift our country hungers for, something every little peasant boy can look forward to, and with pleasure feel he is a part of, something he can work and fight for. This young man was 21 when he was killed by the Nazis.
It's absolutely chilling. But you don't shy away from tough topics in your books. Death appears in several of your books, including the loss of Anne-Marie's older sister in Number the Stars. An older sister also dies in your first book, A Summer to Die. But you describe memories as tributaries that flow into a river. What are some of the tributaries that flowed into creating The Giver, which has death in it as well?
Well, The Giver is a very different sort of book, and it does result, as all books do, from different kinds of memories that come to me. One in particular that went into the making of The Giver came from my living in Japan as a kid, and living in an area of Tokyo which was American-style houses surrounded by a wall. Later, as an adult, I asked my parents, why did you choose to have us live in that fake little American town? Couldn't we have lived out in the Japanese community? And my parents said, yes, we could have, but we thought it would be comfortable and familiar and safe for you kids. Well, personally, I think they made a mistake, and that was one of the things that went into the making of The Giver. By creating a wall around ourselves, by separating ourselves from everything that is foreign or unfamiliar or strange, it's what the people in the book The Giver did in an effort to make themselves comfortable and safe, and that's really what the book is about.
Well, when you were in Japan, I've read that you ventured out as a child.
I did. You want me to tell that story? I ventured out on my bicycle. My parents didn't know. I mean, there wasn't a locked gate on that wall, but I had a bicycle, and I would ride out into the streets of Tokyo. I was 11, 12 years old. And I never talked to anybody, but I would ride out through those crowds of people. Tokyo was such a busy, noisy, colorful place, even after the war. And I would watch all those people who were so foreign to me but so interesting. And I would often ride past a Japanese elementary school. And I would watch the kids my own age on the playground when they were having recess. And there was a boy in that school. He and I would stare at each other, never talk to each other. I knew only little Japanese. He was probably studying English but knew little. And we would look at each other and never speak. And it was many years later when The Giver won the Newbery Medal, and I was there for that ceremony. And each year when that's given, the Caldecott Medal is given at the same time for illustration. And that year, the Caldecott Medal was given to a man named Alan Say, a book called Grandfather's Journey about his own grandfather. And Alan Say is Japanese, although he was living in the United States at that time. And he gave me a copy of his book and signed his name. So I gave him a copy of mine, signed my name, and then I wrote my name in Japanese. And he asked how I happened to be able to do that. I said I lived in Tokyo when I was a kid. Alan is exactly my age. And he asked where I lived in Tokyo. He said, I lived there too. What part did you live in? I told him. He said, that's where I lived. We narrowed it down until he said, were you the girl on the green bike? And so, however many years had passed, Alan and I are now friends, but all those years had passed with us not being friends because We were scared of each other because of that distance, because we were unfamiliar. And again, that's what the book, The Giver, is about.
Jonas's community is very safe. In fact, there's no fear or pain in it. And it sounds rather wonderful until he's named receiver. Tell us about the ceremony in which the 12s are assigned their roles in the community.
You want me to read from that section? In this book, the kids, when they turn 12, are all given their assignments for the future, told what they're going to be. And so one by one, they've been brought to the stage in front of the whole community and given their assignments. But then Jonas, the main character in the book, is called to the stage. And the chief elder says, Jonas has not been assigned. Then she went on, Jonas has been selected. He blinked. What did that mean? He felt a collective questioning stir from the audience because they too were puzzled. In a firm, commanding voice, she announced, Jonas has been selected to be our next receiver of memory. Then he heard the gasp, the sudden intake of breath drawn sharply in astonishment by each of the seated citizens. He saw their faces. Their eyes widened in awe, and still he did not understand. Such a selection is very, very rare, the chief elder told the audience. Our community has only one receiver, and it is he who trains his successor. We've had our current receiver for a very long time, she went on. Jonas followed her eyes and saw that she was looking at one of the elders. The committee of elders was sitting together in a group, and the chief elder's eyes were now on one who sat in the midst, but seemed oddly separate from them. It was a man Jonas had never noticed before, a bearded man with pale eyes. He was watching Jonas intently. We failed in our last selection, the chief elder said solemnly. It was 10 years ago when Jonas was just a toddler. I'll not dwell on the experience because it causes us all terrible discomfort. Jonas didn't know what she was referring to, but he could sense the discomfort of the audience. They shifted uneasily in their seats. We have not been hasty this time, she continued. We could not afford another failure.
Jonas assumes the role of receiver of memories, and his world really begins to change, particularly when a new child comes to live with their family. Could you?
Yep. The new child is called Gabriel, and he's an infant. Jonas is here talking to the giver. He's right at the age where he's learning so much. He grabs toys when we hold them in front of him. My father says he's learning small muscle control, and he's really cute. The giver nodded. And now that I can see colors, at least sometimes, I was just thinking, what if we could hold up things that were bright red or bright yellow, and Gabriel could choose instead of the sameness? He might make wrong choices, the giver said. Oh, Jonas was silent for a minute. Oh, I see what you mean. It wouldn't matter for a new child's toy, but later it does matter, doesn't it? We don't dare to let people make choices of their own. Not safe, the giver suggested. No, definitely not safe, Jonas said with certainty. What if they were allowed to choose their own mate and chose wrong? Or what if, he went on almost laughing at the absurdity, what if they chose their own jobs? Frightening, isn't it? The giver said. Jonas chuckled. Very frightening. I can't even imagine it. We really have to protect people from wrong choices. It's safer, the giver said. Yes, Jonas agreed. Much safer. But when the conversation turned to other things, Jonas was left still with a feeling of frustration that he didn't understand.
So Jonas makes choices, and that really changes the pace. As soon as Jonas starts making different choices.
Scary
choices, yeah. The pace changes. How do you determine how to create the pacing in a novel like The Giver?
Well, in any novel, that's true. You need to change the pacing. These kids here today, writing students, have learned that themselves. And you can feel it when you're writing. I will add, though, that one of the things I do is read what I'm working on. I read it aloud to myself, and I can hear it then, so that when it needs to slow down, and move into perhaps a descriptive passage, or when it's time for dialogue, for people to talk. It's just, I think a person who is a writer feels that. A person who's a reader feels it too in reading. You need, if things are moving along quickly, you need a time when it slows down and you need to relax a bit. It all comes kind of naturally to somebody who's in the process of writing.
Well, what is the relationship of reading and writing?
What is the relationship between reading and writing? You wouldn't be able to write if you didn't read. I think it's fair to say that. Kids often ask me, I want to be a writer, what do you recommend? What is the best advice you can give a young writer? And, some kids might want me to say, you need to have a particular kind of computer, and that will, but my advice is always just that you need to read a lot. That's how we learn the most. And not only reading good stuff, classic literature, I mean, that's wonderful. Read Shakespeare when you get a chance. But even reading bad stuff teaches you how to be a good writer, surprisingly.
The cover of The Giver, I'm going to change subjects again. The cover of The Giver came about in a very interesting way. Can you tell us how this cover came about?
I studied photography in graduate school, and I worked for a while as a photographer. When I was writing for magazines, I was what is called a photojournalist. I would do the photographs and the articles. But I also did a lot of portraits. And this was a man, a magazine had hired me to photograph this man. He was a painter. And so I spent time with him and did a lot of photographs. And in fact, this is back before digital photography. I had a darkroom then. When this photograph and others of him were floating in my darkroom sink, photographs need to be washed. Not anymore, now that they're digital. But one of my kids walked through the room and said, "Who is that, Moses?" And so in my correspondence with this man, whose name was Carl Gustav Nelson, I told him that. And after that, when he wrote to me, he always signed his letters with love from Moses. But that had been many years before. Sometimes when I did a photograph, I would give them to the editor who had hired me to do them, or to the parents who had hired me to photograph a child. But sometimes I would save one, and this was a man whose photographs I had saved. And so when the book was written, I pulled out those old photographs, and he had long since died. The photograph on the cover of Number the Stars is also a child I had photographed 10 years before and had saved this one of her. I contacted her parents to ask permission to use her photograph, and they laughed, and they said, "You have to ask her, she's all grown up." She now has 4 children of her own. So those are two people whom I had photographed years before, and then wrote a book which seemed to demand their photograph on the cover.
That's fascinating. Photographs are certainly a way of capturing memories, and memories, making them, keeping them, sharing them, run through all of your books, or many of your books. Dreams, which seem to be memories, are bestowed in Gossamer. They're shared by the giver. They're remembered by Anne Marie. Talk about your memories in your writing.
I think memories and dreams, and they're connected, as you said, are things that are always fascinating to people. It's because they're so much a part of us and so individual, but quite mysterious. If we can go to dreams for a moment, I'll just tell you very briefly. My mother, who has died years ago, but in the last years of her life, she had a stroke, and she was in a nursing home. And her mind was elsewhere. I have no idea where her mind was. She didn't recognize my brother and me. Fortunately, after 5 months, she woke up one morning and was fine. And we took her home, and she lived several more years. But during those months there, my brother called me. He went to visit her one day, and he said she had been crying as if she were heartbroken, and she kept saying, "I'm so sad, Dorothy's baby has died, Dorothy's baby has died." My brother called me and said, "What's all that about?" Well, I remembered when I was 13, and my little brother was 6 years younger than 13, 7, my mother's best friend was named Dorothy, and Dorothy and her husband had no children, but suddenly she was expecting a baby, and we were all thrilled. But Dorothy's baby was born and only lived a few days. So clearly, that's what Mother was referring to. My brother asked her, "Mother, when you were crying because Dorothy's baby had died, were you seeing Dorothy? Were you with Dorothy? Or were you remembering Dorothy?" And my mother looked at him, my brother said, as if he were an idiot, And she said, in the dream world, that doesn't matter. Well, I became fascinated by that. I have no idea what she meant. And when she woke up 5 months later, she didn't remember either what the dream world was like. But I began to think about the dream world and where dreams come from and what it's like there in that place where time is all complicated and mixed up and doesn't matter what happened when. And that's when I wrote the book Gossamer about dreams and where they come from.
Well, dreams are fascinatingly presented in that book, and they connect in a very concrete way to the real world in that book.
It's interesting because that's the only book in which I've written in which there are realistic characters, human characters, with problems that humans have, and then there's a world of fantasy characters. And the two sets of characters never see each other throughout the book, and yet they affect each other very deeply. I'm about to go to Chicago to see Gossamer on the stage. I've adapted it to the stage, and it's been performed various places. And to see how they deal with the two sets of characters is fascinating.
It's going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
You don't seem to write the same kind of book.
Oh, I hope not.
Oh, no, you always write very freshly, but not all of your books have such serious themes. You've written about a family called the Willoughbys. How did you come to know the family called the Willoughbys?
The Willoughbys probably emerged from the books that I read in my childhood. And since I've already told you what year I was born, you know that I'm 72 years old, and my childhood was a long time ago. And there weren't the wonderful kids' books that there are today. What I read were childhood classics. And they often were filled with these kinds of characters who came back to me in a funny way when I started writing this very old-fashioned kind of book. You want me to read some?
Sure.
Once upon a time, it says, there was a family named Willoughby, an old-fashioned type of family with 4 children. The eldest was a boy named Timothy. He was 12. Barnaby and Barnaby were 10-year-old twins. No one could tell them apart. And it was even more confusing because they had the same name, so they were known as Barnaby A and Barnaby B. Most people, including their parents, shortened this to A and B, and many were unaware that the twins even had names. There was also a girl, the youngest, and her name was Jane. Their lives proceeded in exactly the way lives proceeded in old-fashioned stories. One day, they even found a baby on their doorstep. This happens quite often in old-fashioned stories. The Bobbsey twins, for example, found a baby on their doorstep once, but it had never happened to the Willoughbys before. The baby was in a wicker basket and wearing a pink sweater that had a note attached to it with a safety pin. I wonder why Father didn't notice it when he left for work, Barnaby A. said, looking down at the basket. That's true. I loved the Bobbsey twins when I was a child, and please don't go back and find them in your library and reread them because they're terrible books. They're racist and sexist, and they have nothing whatsoever to recommend them. But the Bobbsey twins did find a baby on their doorstep, and I wanted very badly to have that happen to me when I was a kid. So it happens to the Willoughbys.
Well, in addition to the really unusual characters and the really unusual family, and the old-fashioned feel to the book, you use rich language throughout. All of your books have rich language, but it's particularly appropriate in this satire, I suppose.
And did you notice the glossary in the back?
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. Why did you include a glossary at the back?
Because I used a lot of big words in this book, and I wanted to explain them to kids.
But your definitions aren't the typical definitions.
No, they aren't. They're quite personalized. Here, I just turned at random to this. Glutinous. Do you guys know what glutinous means? I'm about to tell you. It's in the glossary. It means just what it sounds like, sticky and disgusting. When my dog has to take a pill, I disguise the pill by putting it inside a glutinous wad of mozzarella cheese, and my dog gulps it right down. And here, across the page, irascible means having outbursts of bad temper. I myself had a very irascible third-grade teacher, and it made for a miserable year.
I think that's, I love
And
your
did you notice
definitions.
that it's ignominiously illustrated by the author, too?
Yes, I did.
Ignominious, which is described in the glossary, means not very good. I'm not an artist, but I did illustrate that book.
You did a darn good approximation there. You've recently moved on to picture books. A book that's just out is called Crow Call. Tell us about how this book came about and share a few
Okay,
pages
this
when we
book
get it.
is autobiographical, and I love the color. The artist, and I did not ignominiously illustrate this. This is beautifully illustrated by Bagram Ibatulin. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I've never met him. He was given a photograph of me as a little girl. I think it's in the back of this book, yes. And so he made the little girl in the book look very much like I did. And this is about a particular day in my life. I mentioned that my father had been off in the Pacific during World War II. And when he returned, briefly, because he had to go back to Japan, he was a stranger to me. And I knew I loved him, and I knew I had missed him, but I was also scared of him. And so this book is about a day, just a few hours in one day when I was probably 9 years old. It says it's morning, early, barely light, cold for November. At home in the bed next to mine, Jessica, my older sister, still sleeps, but my bed is empty. I sit shyly in the car, in the front seat of the car next to the stranger who is my father. My legs pulled up under the too large wool shirt I am wearing. I practice his name to myself, whispering it under my breath. Daddy, Daddy. Saying it feels new. The war has lasted so long. He has been gone so long. Finally, I look over at him timidly and speak aloud. Looks just like me. Daddy, I said, I've never gone hunting before. What if I don't know what to do? Well, he said, I've been thinking about that, and I've decided to put you in charge of the crow call. Have you ever operated a crow call? I shake my head. No. It's an art, he said. No doubt about that, but I'm pretty sure you can handle it. Some people will blow and blow on a crow call, and not a single crow will even wake up or bother to listen, much less answer, but I really think you can do it. Of course, he adds, chuckling, having that shirt will help. It was a real shirt that was way too big for me. I saw it in a men's clothing store. I was with my father. He saw how much I wanted that shirt, and so he bought it for me. And the sleeves there are rolled up. But I wore that shirt for many, many years. And this story is about a child becoming reacquainted with her father, who's been gone for a long time in the war. Sadly, it could be a story about a child today, about a child almost at any time in history. For me, it was World War II. It could have been the Korean War. It could have been a father coming back from the Vietnam War. It could be a father or a mother coming home from Afghanistan or Iraq today.
Was the text of this story written for children?
This story was actually written for adults. It's slightly changed in this book, but it was published in an adult magazine way back in 1976. And it was only last year that a children's book editor came to me, having read the story, and said, could we make it into a picture book? So I made a few changes to make it more accessible to kids, but it's a story that's been around for a long time.
Well, what is the difference between writing for children and writing for adults?
To me, I don't think there is a whole lot of difference. If I were to write, people sometimes ask me, why don't you write adult novels? Well, I could do that. The things you put into a book are the same. The difference would be that the main character would be an adult. Kids usually like to read about people their age or slightly older. You guys here in the audience, whatever ages you are, say 10 to 17, you probably don't want to sit down and read a book about a guy who's 75 because you're more interested in what people your own age are doing and thinking and decisions you make. And that's why we read, I think, to identify with the main character, to follow them through their problems and figure out what we would do if we were they. And that's how I think we enjoy reading and how we rehearse our own lives by reading and through literature.
So what you're saying is that there's really very little difference.
I don't think there is, yeah.
Well, I think there's an emotional content that readers of any age can grasp onto or relate to. Do you find it's different writing a short story or a picture book than a novel?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of difference. A novel, you can put in a lot of stuff in a novel because you got space, and sometimes you put in too much stuff. And we've all read novels that go on too long, perhaps. But if you're writing a short story, and a picture book really is a short story, it has to have a beginning, middle, and end, but you have to pare it down so that only the essential ingredients are there because you don't have room for more. And so it's really harder, I think, to write a short story than it is a novel. And the hardest of all, and I'm not a poet, but a poem has to be pared down even farther than a short story, so that every word is important in a poem. Every sentence is important in a short story. And in a novel, you have more space and more excess.
Well, Linda Sue Park, who is both a poet and a novelist, and a picture book writer, actually, says,
And a friend of mine, to boot.
Okay. Well, she says that she uses Lois Lowry's novel structure. So tell us how you build character.
Linda Sue has said that, I think, on her website, hasn't she? And I should go back and read that because I think she got that information from a speech I made one time, and it was years ago, and I've forgotten exactly what I said. Do you have the list of ingredients?
Well, I do.
As it happens?
She says that you have to build character, quest, complications and choices, climax, conclusion, and change.
Okay, now see, when I was writing that, and I believe that to be true, but I was carefully choosing things that all began with the same letter. That was just gimmicky on my part. But certainly those are the ingredients for either a story or a novel. You start with a character. And quest, I think that isn't the same letter, but it has the same feel to it. The character has to need or want something very badly. And then the character will go on a journey, maybe not a geographic journey, although in this very simple story, the character goes out in the morning with her father. She wants something very badly. She wants to have her father back again as a father she knows and remembers and loves. And so that has to be accomplished in the space of this journey. They go off in the car together. And by the end of the story, they have accomplished that. But along the way, there are complications. Is that the third thing you said?
Yeah,
complications,
that's...
questions. And if you're writing a novel, there are going to be a lot more complications along the way than there are in a story. What word comes next? Choices, yes. Along the way, the character makes choices. And in this book, this very simple story, both the child character and the father make an important choice, which brings them together at the end. And that's the climax of the book. The book is where these things come together. In a novel, it will be farther along. And the character has to have undergone some change. In this case, both the child character and the father have changed by the end of the day they've spent together. In a novel, the main character will not be the same person on page 183 that he or she was on page 1, because he or she will have undergone some very important change.
Catherine Patterson, another Newbery medalist, has said that hope has to be in novels for young people. Do you agree with that?
Hope, it's an interesting word for her to use. Yes, I do agree with it. The book, The Giver, ends in an ambiguous way. And a lot of people, after the book was published, thought that the boy, and the baby perhaps as well, were dead at the end of the book. That had never occurred to me. I always saw that as an optimistic, and to use Catherine's word, a hopeful ending. Later, I was to write 2 more books that makes clear what has happened to Jonas and Gabriel by the book, the 3rd book, Messenger. They're both characters in that book. I'm even thinking about writing a 4th one, which will focus on Gabriel as a teenager. It's hard, though. I'm having trouble figuring that one out. But I think it's important, particularly when you're writing for kids, as I do, that there be optimism. And I tend to be an optimistic person anyway, but I think the endings of all my books are hopeful.
Even though they are.
I got to point out, though, that in the Willoughbys, should I tell the terrible thing? These kids have terrible parents. I mean, these parents are despicable, and you'll find despicable in the glossary. And it turns out the parents are trying to figure out a way to get rid of the children. They don't like their children. And so the children, at the same time, are trying to figure out a way to get rid of the parents. And since all of my books, the children are the heroes of my books, they're the ones who win out in the end. And in fact, these 4 kids do away with their parents by the end of the book. That will probably get me into
it's terribly
something.
satisfying.
Yeah. It's a very, the parents are dead at the end of the book. I'm sorry to tell you that, but it's a funny death.
And it's a
They
worthy.
die smiling.
It's a worthy death.
Worthy. They deserve it. Yes.
Yes, they do. How do you decide what tough topics, and how do you incorporate difficult topics?
Well, I think, you know, all of our lives, even those of you who haven't lived as long as I have, which is everybody in the world almost, incorporate, you know, both good and bad. And, well, I'll just tell you a funny, this isn't funny, but an interesting thing. My father had a movie camera when I was a child. And so when we were little, this is before television, it was always fun when Dad would get out the home movies. And one of the movies that we used to look at as children is me playing on the beach in Hawaii in 1940 with my grandmother who had come to visit. And so I've looked at that scene a zillion times. There's Grandma wearing a dress on the beach, and there's me in overalls playing on the beach with a bucket and a shovel, and the wind blows my hat off, and I laugh and pull the hat back on. And I never noticed until my father was very old, and I was transferring those old home movies onto videotape for him as a gift, because the movies were starting to deteriorate. And so I now had a videotape of this same scene, and I put it into my television at home before I sent it to my dad. And I had a friend visiting who was watching it. My friend had been a naval officer, the captain of a nuclear submarine, and he had been stationed in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. And so he's watching this, and he was interested because it was Honolulu, where he had once lived. And then he suddenly said, stop, rewind and go back, and he did. And he pointed out something I had never seen before. There's the little girl and her grandmother playing on the beach in the foreground. But in the background, moving slowly across the horizon, is a ship which my friend identified as the Arizona. The Arizona contained 1,100 men, young men, most of them, several sets of brothers, interestingly. Within several months, they would all be dead. They would all be killed at Pearl Harbor. And the Arizona is still under the water there, and there's a memorial built on top of it. You can go out to that memorial, you can look down and see that ship. The bodies have never been removed. So now I look again at my videotape, and there's the little girl laughing, grabbing at her hat, playing with her much-loved grandmother, and there in the background, 1,100 men are about to die. And I feel as though that's what I do in books. There's always the laughter, the interrelationship of human beings, the love and affection people have for each other, and there's always the tragedy that's ongoing in everyone's life, and that happens to all of us in one way or another. It's what, in The Giver, they tried to get rid of. Don't let people know that there's anything bad that ever happens. It will make them feel good. And yet, I think, if you've never experienced sadness, you can't really appreciate happiness. That's what all art and music comes from, is sadness and tragedy. I'm blathering. I'm going on and on. But
in Gossamer, you suggest that in order to have good dreams, you also have to have the synesthetes, which is an interesting way of imagining nightmare. In the book Gossamer, the little magical creatures who bring us our dreams, or the dreams to the characters in the book, do so by gathering the memories of each character. And it's important that they gather the sad things as well as the happy memories, because all of those combine to make the story of that person. Puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
It gives weight and meaning. You've created some very unusual families. I'm thinking particularly about the Krupnik. Well, maybe they're not so unusual, it's just real and highly imaginative. I'm thinking of Anastasia Krupnik, the Krupnik family, and Gunibird Green, and what her family must be like. I know what her second grade teacher has to deal with.
You know, I never went to second grade myself. I learned to read before I went to school, so when I then went to school, here was this kid who already learned all that stuff, so they put me in 3rd grade. 2nd grade in this elementary school had a wonderful teacher, and there was always a lot of fun going on in her class. Did you notice when I read from the glossary of the Willoughbys, I mentioned irascible, that I had an irascible 3rd grade teacher? I really had a terrible 3rd grade teacher. She was mean. And in 2nd grade, I could hear the kids laughing and having fun, and also the teacher lived on a farm, and every spring she took the kids all out there and they rode ponies. I missed out on all of that. So I always had this fantasy of what 2nd grade was like. And when I sat down to write the first Goonie Bird book, and this is, I think, the 4th, I created a 2nd grade classroom, probably because I'd always had this fantasy about 2nd grade. But also, as a child, I was painfully shy. I was the kind of kid who always looks at the floor and mumbles. And I deeply envied kids who were self-confident, self-assured, and popular and outgoing. And so I created a kid who, on her first day of 2nd grade in the first book, it's October, and school has already started. Because my family moved a lot, I was often thrust into a classroom after school had begun. Very, very difficult for a shy kid. But in the first Goonie Bird book, it's October. The door to the classroom opens. A little girl walks in wearing pajamas and cowboy boots. And she says, "I'm your new student. I want a desk right smack in the middle of everything." And that was because she's the kind of kid I wanted to be, as was Anastasia in the earlier books.
So rather than writing about the Lois that was, you're
writing about the Lois that I wished I had been. That's what people who write get to do. They get to recreate their own lives. I have written about the real me in 2 books, A Summer to Die, and another one called Autumn Street, which is autobiographical, and that's the child that I really was.
And you also wrote a memoir.
Oh, that's true, yes.
That's right.
It's
so
right behind you there on the wall.
That's right. What can we expect next from Lois Lowry?
Oh, next is going to be fun. 2 things coming out next. In the spring is a book called The Birthday Ball. It's a full-length novel, but it's based on, it's kind of a satire of old fairy tales, and it has all those ingredients from fairy tales you read or that were read to you as a child. There's a princess and a queen and a king, and the princess has to choose among the men who are wooing her and wanting to marry her. But the thing that makes it unusual is that the princess hates being a princess. She doesn't want to be a princess. The queen screws everything up because she's deaf and she misunderstands everything that everybody is saying. The king has no interest in who his daughter's going to choose. He's only interested in his butterfly collection. And the suitors, the men who are coming to this ball to be chosen by the princess, are the most disgusting trio. There are 3 of them, except that one of them is actually 2 because he's conjoined twins, so there are 2 of them. So there are these suitors who are so repulsive and disgusting that they're, I think, funny. And also, they have been illustrated, and the whole book has been illustrated by Jules Pfeiffer.
Oh, perfect.
Who is so fabulous. He's a cartoonist, and so he's illustrated that. And then following that is another book. Most times it takes me close to a year to write a book, revise it, and all the rest of it. This summer, I sat down one day, it was 4th of July weekend, and began to write a book. And I did so for a particular reason. This had not been in my mind, but I was sitting in my farmhouse in Maine by myself. Nobody was there with me that day. And I saw a little movement off there to my side. I looked around, and there, sitting on the floor, was a mouse. It was actually sitting on its back legs, sitting up, and it had big ears and big eyes. It looked like a stuffed mouse, a toy. It didn't look like the kind of mice that go in and scoot around and eat the stuff in your pantry. This was a different sort of mouse. I went over to him. I said nobody was there with me. Actually, my dog was there. My dog went over to him, and the mouse looked at us. I picked him up. I took him outside. I set him down. I took a photograph. I have a picture of my dog there with his nose right up to this mouse, and the mouse is not at all scared. It was bizarre. I went inside because I didn't want to know what my dog was going to do with that mouse. And my dog came in a little after, and I never saw the mouse again, but I don't think my dog ate it. I think the mouse scampered off. any rate, I sat down, I began to write a story. I wasn't sure what I was writing, about a mouse. Turned out to be a full-length novel. Well, it's 122 pages. It's a short novel. I wrote it in 2 weeks, and I sent it to my editor and said, surprise, I told you I was working on other stuff, but look at this. The editor said, we love it, we'll publish it. They didn't ask me to revise it. It was like magical. So here's a book about a mouse, and they're looking for just the right illustrator now.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I should add title, Church Mouse. The mouse lives in the walls of a church.
That seems appropriate somehow.
And I told you also that I'm thinking about and sort of working on a book 4 to the Giver trilogy.
Yeah. We've run out of time, Lois Lowry. Many thanks for being with us today. I'd also like to thank the students in the studio from Stonewall Jackson High School and Parkside Middle School. Thanks, too, to the viewing audience from across the country for tuning into the program. Goodbye.